Hello everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. This is going to be a podcast type of a video on colonial society in the 18th century or the 1700s. We are going to go over some of the important aspects of the original 13 British colonies in North America. You can see the area we are talking about on the screen. We are going to go over the rapid population growth in the 13 colonies, the structure of colonial society, including general characteristics of the family during the 1700s. Remember, this time is well after the establishment of Jamestown and the Plymouth colonies, but before the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. You will notice that the British colonies matured quickly by the 1760s and constituted a new kind of society with characteristics and forces that shaped a, quote, new people. Let's start with population growth. At the start of the 1700s, the English colonies on the Atlantic coast had a population of barely 250,000 Europeans and Africans. By 1775, the figure had jumped to 2.5 million, a tenfold increase within the span of a single lifetime. The spectacular gains in population during this period resulted from two factors: immigration of almost 1 million people from Europe and a sharp natural increase caused chiefly by a high birth rate among colonial families. An abundance of fertile American land and dependable food supply attracted thousands of European settlers each year and also supported the raising of large families. The single largest group of non-English immigrants did not come to the Americas by choice. They were Africans or descendants of Africans who had been taken captive, forced into European ships, and sold as enslaved laborers to Southern plantation owners and other colonists. Some Africans were granted their freedom after years of forced labor. Outside the South, thousands of African Americans worked at a broad range of occupations such as laborers, bricklayers, and blacksmiths. Some of these workers were enslaved. Others were free wage earners and property owners. Among African Americans, the population increase was even more dramatic, from about 28,000 in 1701 to 500,000 in 1775. Aside from African Americans and English Americans, some of the other major colonists were of German descent. This group of non-English immigrants settled chiefly on the rich farmland west of Philadelphia, in an area which would eventually become known as the Pennsylvania Dutch country. So think in the Lancaster County area of Pennsylvania. The Scot-Irish, these English-speaking people, emigrated from Northern Ireland. Since their ancestors had moved to Ireland from Scotland, they were commonly known as Scot-Irish or Scots-Irish. They had little respect for the British government, which had pressured them into leaving Ireland. Most settled along the frontier in the western parts of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and even down into Georgia. By 1775, they comprised 7% of the British colonial population. Other European groups included French Protestants, also known as Huguenots, the Dutch, and the Swedes. These groups made up 5% of the population of all the colonies by 1775. Now let's move on to some general characteristics of the British colonies. Self-government. The government of each colony had a representative assembly that was elected by eligible voters, limited to white male property owners. In only 2 colonies, Rhode Island and Connecticut, was the governor also elected by the people. The governors of other colonies were either appointed by the Crown, for example in New York and Virginia, or by a proprietor that started the colony, as was the case in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Religious toleration in the colonies. All the colonies permitted the practice of different religions, but with varying degrees of freedom. Massachusetts, the most conservative, accepted several types of Protestants, but it excluded non-Christians and Catholics. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania were the most liberal of the 13 colonies and allowed the most religious freedom. In the colonies, there were no hereditary aristocracies. The social extremes of Europe, with a nobility that inherited special privileges and large masses of the hungry poor, were simply non-existent in the colonies. A narrow class system based on economics was developed. Wealthy landowners were at the top. Craft workers and small farmers made up the majority of the common people. There was a large degree of social mobility in the colonies. With the major exception, of course, of African Americans, all people in colonial society had an opportunity to improve their standard of living and social status by work. Now for families in the colonies. The family was the economic and social center of colonial life. With an expanding economy and ample food supply, people married at a younger age and reared more children than in Europe. More than 90% of people lived on farms in the colonies. While life in coastal communities and on the frontier was hard, most colonists had a higher standard of living than did their European counterparts. So let's talk about some of the differences between men and women in the colonies. While wealth was increasingly being concentrated in the hands of a few, most men did work. Landowning was primarily reserved for men, who also dominated politics. English law gave the husband almost unlimited power in the home, including the right to abuse his wife. Women in the colonies. The average colonial wife bore 8 children and performed a wide range of tasks. These tasks included cooking, cleaning, making clothes, and providing medical care, and in many cases would help on the farm or in the family store. Women also educated the children. Divorce was legal but rare, and women had limited legal and political rights. Yet the shared labors and mutual dependence with their husbands gave most women an active role in decision-making. So this was just a brief overview of some of the aspects in the 13 British colonies during the 1700s. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.